All right. Good morning, Peacemakers. Well, that sounded
Good morning.
less enthusiastic than I'd hoped. Let's try that again. Good morning, Peacemakers.
Good morning.
Better. Um, the good news is that's the last time you're going to hear me say that. We've only got one more class after this. So we're not doing the meeting. So we are winding down, which is fascinating. It seems like we just started in a lot of ways. We are going to talk about looking to the interests of others this morning. And, that's something we talked about throughout this class. Obviously, that's I think a central theme of the idea of being a peacemaker, of resolving conflict is that, we have to look to the interests of others, consider their needs, work together to resolve conflict. But we're going to look very specifically at this concept, what the Scripture says about it, and also some practical wisdom about how we can consider others, how we can make sure that we are understanding their position, understanding their interests, so that we can work together and come to a peaceful solution. Philippians chapter 2, verses 3 through 4, a verse we've read many, many times, and we're going to read it again. Somebody read that for us. Okay. So there's kind of a comparison made here, right, between how we should act, how we should consider others, and what often gets in the way of that. What is it that gets in the way? Yeah. Selfishness. The passage here says selfish ambition or conceit. When we look to our own interests, when we're thinking about our own desires, the things that are going to make us happy. The word conceit is a word that we don't use as much anymore. Some definitions of that are excessive pride in oneself. Kind of the main definition of that. Some synonyms would be like vanity, narcissism, that kind of thing. So we're talking about just that deep-seated selfishness in the way that we behave, the way that we treat others, and that idea of selfish ambition. The desire to enrich oneself, the desire to make oneself, appear grander or greater than we are, that kind of thing, these are all very human problems. These are all things that all of us deal with at some point or another. And, on the way here in the car, kids fussing over who can have what toy, this kind of thing. And, their idea of sharing, a child's idea of sharing is you get it for 5 seconds and I get it for the rest of the day. And see, we both had a turn. That's that's fair in selfish eyes. And so, we've got to be careful that we grow out of that, that we grow beyond that.
Some people never do.
Pardon?
Some people never do.
Right, absolutely, absolutely. And that comes from a lot of different things, but it certainly can be the root cause of a lot of conflict. To let each of you look not only to his own interests, and I think this is important to notice. Does this passage say just completely ignore your own interests? No. It says look not only to your own interests, but to the interests of others. They both need to be considered. And I think that's an important thing to note there, that even though We need to consider others even more highly than ourselves. We don't need to be doormats either. This is not a passage of just totally letting people walk all over you in that sense either. But I think it's interesting if we go on with this same passage here. He goes on, and sometimes we just read that little section there, but he goes on and he gives this great example of, the perfect example of this kind of attitude in Philippians chapter 2, verses 5 through 8. Somebody read that for us.
Mind among yourselves, which is yours in Christ Jesus, who, though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped. He emptied himself, by taking the form of a servant, and born in the likeness of men, being found in human form, he humbled himself, by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross.
Okay. So, Jesus, it says here, he did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself by taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men. So Jesus, who was God, part of the Trinity, became flesh, emptied himself, it says, and took on this lower form, this much, much lower form, unworthy of his majesty, was that fleshly body. And I've always struggled a little bit with this phrase here. He says, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped. That's a hard phrase. That's a hard thing for us to understand, I think, when we consider that, Jesus is God. Jesus is part of this Holy Trinity, and yet it says he didn't count equality with God a thing to be grasped. And in reading this and studying this, there was a footnote in my Bible that said another way of translating that word grasp is it's not something to be held on to. It's not something to be used for his advantage. And that changed my whole perspective about this. And when we think about Jesus and we think about the power that he had and the things that he could do, and we talk about this sometimes, if you had those abilities and you still had your, just fleshly, humanistic ego and desires, what would you do with that? Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you'd be party trick champion, forever. You'd make those Dude Perfect guys look like chumps. I mean, because it wouldn't take you 300 takes to do that thing. You do it first try every time. We in our simplistic thinking would use all of those powers and all of those abilities for ourselves, to make ourselves look cool, to gain wealth and wisdom for ourselves. And we even see that in the first century there, that people wanted to obtain that gift that the apostles had so they could use it for their own evil purposes. And Jesus had all that power and he had all that ability, but he never used it as something for himself. What did Jesus use his ability to do miracles and his ability to know and understand the hearts of men? What did he always use those things for? Pardon?
To lead them to God.
Yeah. To glorify God. To show them who he was, never to build himself up, to glorify God and to show them what was coming, to show them the salvation that he came to bring, and to teach and to admonish those who were seeking the truth.
Less than God
Well, and absolutely especially when Jesus is taking on this earthly frame for sure as well, that he was accepting that subservient role, and I certainly see your point about the Trinity and about the purpose and the the I guess the differences in the three parts there, and again those are heady concepts, but absolutely there is an element of that is he is accepting his role in the situation, and accepting that he has this purpose to fulfill.
He never did claim, he never did use that. I think position in anything that he did while he was here, and he couldn't do it and still do the will of his Father. He had to let go of that godless heavenly status in order to come to earth as a man and be crucified.
Yeah, I mean, it's a hard thing to even grasp how someone could have all that he had and still possessed, even in his earthly form, the power that he had, the wisdom that he had, the knowledge that he had, and still maintain that humility, and still completely void of ego. That is so hard for us to wrap our minds around, because we have none of that, and yet we still are always battling ego. We're still always battling pride and selfishness and all those things, and completely unmerited in any way, especially when we consider ourselves in comparison to him and the life that he lived. It says that he, being found in human form, humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross.
John is limited to different versions of Christian Standard Bible. Did not consider equality with God something to be exploited.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It was not something to be used for his own ends. It was not something to be taken advantage of. It was something to use to glorify God, to do his will, and to be obedient. Christ, ultimately, in everything he did, was being obedient to the will of God. And in the garden, when he's praying, let this cup pass from me, his will, he knew what that meant, to be obedient to God. It meant that he was going to suffer, and suffer greatly. And he didn't necessarily want that in that human way, in the same way that none of us would want to suffer the things that he did. But he was obedient, and obedient to the point of death, meaning the death that he suffered. Great quote that I think we've all seen at some time or another about humility is not thinking less of yourself, but rather thinking of yourself less. And I think this is an important way to look at it, because oftentimes when we talk about humility, one of our struggles is we feel like, well, if I'm going to be humble, if I'm going to put others before me, then that means I'm just garbage. I'm just nothing. I'm not to be considered. I'm not to be thought about, and that can be disheartening. That can be problematic. And hopefully, when we are around people who are also humble, and we're around people who also have a godly attitude, they will also consider us as we consider them. But this idea of thinking of yourself less is I think, important distinction. That it's not that we are not, that we have no self-worth, that we have no purpose or whatever you want to insert in there. It's that we don't concern ourselves with that as the primary concern. And so,
whether you think too much of yourself or you think too little of yourself, either way you're thinking of yourself.
yeah.
So there's a way that inferiority and keeping yourself down is prideful, even though it's not the way that we think, it's not prideful in the conceited way, but it's prideful in the inward looking way.
Very good. Yes. Thank you. It was trying to figure out how to explain that. And that is the perfect way of saying it. Regardless of whether you're thinking of yourself as being worthless or you're thinking of yourself as being much greater than you are, you're spending way too much time thinking of yourself. That's a perfect way of putting it. So we need to be careful about that. So when we're looking into the interests of others, when we're thinking about others, when we're trying to negotiate a peaceful solution to a problem, when we think about negotiation, when we negotiate with people, we often come to it with a competitive mindset. And, you know, I don't know anybody who loves to negotiate more than Ron Atkins. We used to go to a lot of basketball games, and the primary sport we were coming to spectate was him buying the tickets, because it was always fun. It was always interesting. And, you know, that was the days where digital tickets, when you had to go out on the street corner somewhere and find a guy who had the tickets and negotiate a price. And, you know, if you like that kind of thing, you know, the value of anything is kind of a fascinating concept, because there's a lot of people who think their baseball cards are worth $7 zillion, but, you know, in reality, they're sitting in their basement. And, you know, maybe one of them is worth something to somebody, but you got to find that person and all that kind of stuff. But, so negotiating value is always kind of a fun topic. But there's a competitive aspect that comes into play when we're negotiating about things. And, you know, and things like, you know, trying to buy basketball tickets or whatever, that's not a big deal, really. I mean, you know, we're going to come to a price or we're not, and nobody's going to be harmed if either way, unless, you know, we're selling fake tickets or something like that. But when we are dealing with conflicts, when we're dealing with real emotional things, when we're dealing even with material things that have become, you know, a conflict between brethren, or even between us and people in the world, when we negotiate with someone and our primary focus, our sole motivation is, I've got to win, we've got a problem, right? Because if I have to win and you have to win, are we ever going to come to a solution? Not likely. It's not likely that we're going to come to a solution. And if we do come to a solution, if somebody just gives up, are we going to walk away still friends? Are we going to walk away with the kind of attitude and the kind of heart that we should walk away from it? I don't think so. So this competitive model of negotiation does not belong in peacemaking. Cooperative negotiation, on the other hand, eliminates this competitive aspect, and it focuses on seeking to better understand one another's positions and interests so that we can find a reasonable solution. This idea of looking to the interests of others is very much a two-way street. It's very much a two-way communication of, what are you needing to get out of this? What is motivating you? What is your interest in this situation? And how can we work together to better understand one another so that we can come to a reasonable solution, that our relationship is not going to be harmed, and we can move forward as brothers or sisters or whatever the relationship may be, rather than as enemies or combatants. And so that's what we want to look at. That's what we want to think about in trying to find solutions to our conflicts. And let's look at a few more passages here that relate to this idea. Matthew chapter 22 in verse 39, Jesus here has told them the first commandment is love your Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. This is the first and greatest commandment. And verse 39, and a second is like it, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. And so if we love our neighbor as ourselves, if we consider their interests just as much as we consider our own, are we going to have competitive negotiations? Are we going to make sure that we win every time that we come into some kind of conflict and we have to work together to find a solution? No. Winning in this scenario looks like both of us getting back to the way we were. Our relationship being restored to what it was. Both of us walking away satisfied that not only have we solved this problem, but we have demonstrated love to one another. We've demonstrated the love of Christ to those around us. Turn over to 1 Corinthians chapter 13 and verse 5. Passage that we hear a lot read at weddings and well, mostly weddings. Starting back at verse 4, love is patient and kind. Love does not envy or boast. It is not arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. It is not irritable or resentful. And so often when we find ourselves in conflict, and we find ourselves trying to figure out, how are we going to move forward? How are we going to solve this problem? What gets in the way? Insisting on our own way, being irritable, when our emotions are inflamed and we are upset, being resentful, when someone has wronged us, when someone has harmed us and we're trying to find a way to get past it, being resentful is something that's going to stand in the way of it and make it very difficult for us to find a solution to the problem. And so we need to consider one another to try to avoid that. And then Matthew chapter 7 and verse 12. This is what we commonly call the golden rule. So whatever you wish that others would do to you, do also to them, for this is the law and the prophets. If you want someone else to treat you fairly, I'll say fairly in air quotes, because we have a strange concept, a strange definition of fair sometimes. Like I was saying earlier about our boys in the back seat of the car, fair to them is I get it first and I get it the most, but we're still sharing. And so we need to make sure that we don't have that kind of attitude, that we're considering one another and in considering our own interests, understanding that that other person has interest as well. Any thoughts or comments about cooperation versus competition? I know we brought this up once before, but I don't think you were here. But your dad has a great quote on, I think it's painted on the wall at Modern, about what a good deal is.
It's not a good deal, but it's fair to part of it.
Right, absolutely. I think that's a great way of looking at it. And we've talked around these words a little bit, but I think they're important to understand. In understanding how do we consider the interests of others and what are interests. And there's two words here that we need to understand, interests and positions. And this kind of thing is taught a lot about negotiating and trying to work with others. And there are two very different things, although sometimes they get conflated. But in order to be able to negotiate effectively with somebody, we've got to understand where they're coming from. We've got to understand what's motivating them. And this kind of information is revealed in a couple different ways. And positions are stated desires. If we're having a conflict with a neighbor over a fence, and I use this example because we have some neighbors who have had some conflicts about fences. This is not necessarily the conflict, but fences are just kind of a fascinating thing with neighbors anyway. Somebody might say, well, I think it's your responsibility to pay for the fence. And, people get into conflicts about trees that are on fence lines and whose responsibility is it if it falls and what if it hits something and all those kinds of things. And so the initial response is, well, I think it's your responsibility. Well, I think it's your responsibility. And so there's an impasse because their stated positions are that it's the other person's fault. It's the other person's responsibility. When you have a car accident, everybody wants to know who's at fault. Because that matters. Because it matters on who's going to pay for it in a lot of situations, or whose insurance is going to pay for it. That kind of thing. So we have these stated positions. This is what I think should happen. My position is, this is what I want to happen. This is what I think should happen. But what's not revealed in our positions are our interests, oftentimes. What's motivating us? What is causing us to take that position? Interests are our underlying values or motivations. Maybe a situation of, what I really mean is, I can't afford to pay for these things. I don't have the money to pay for these things. I'm embarrassed to say that, but I can't fix this. And I just don't want to admit that. Or it may be that, I don't want to admit responsibility. I don't want to admit fault in the situation. So there may be things that are underlying the positions we take in order to come to them. And, I think if we think back to the exercise we did with the scenario, it's been however long that's been, 6 or 8 weeks ago. We read through the first part of it, and we talked about it, and then we got to the second part of it. And when we got to the second part of it, we learned a little bit about that person's interests, right? About their motivations. And how much did that change your perspective on the conflict when you learned about their interests, when you learned about what was causing them to behave in the way that they did? It changed a lot, right? And if we never come to find out that kind of information, if we never take the time to talk, to communicate, to ask questions, and then to listen to the answers, we're never going to understand people's interests. We're never going to understand their motivations. And so we're always going to be missing a lot of key information. So it's very important for us to have the kind of attitude to calm down, slow down, and talk, and to listen, so that we can understand not only their positions, but also the interests that are behind those things. And then this is kind of a long discussion, and you can spend some more time looking at this yourselves, but you can find a lot of information about this online, different places. There's it's kind of a framework that's called the pause principle. And it's sort of a model for negotiating. And so the author of the book here has kind of added some biblical context to it, but it's a way of thinking about, how do we look at the principles of negotiation, the things that we need to do in order to come to a solution, and think about it in such a way that we can work together, not in a competitive way, but in a cooperative way. And the first step is to prepare. And this is often the thing that I think we really fail at the most is preparation. We don't stop and think about the situation. We don't pray about it enough. We don't stop and consider what the Scripture says about resolving conflicts and all those different things. And we don't stop and just get the facts and just really try to understand the situation. A lot of us just haven't watched enough Dragnet to remember Joe Friday always wanted what? Just the facts, man, right? Fun fact. Not one time in the show Dragnet did he ever utter that phrase. He would always ask for the facts, but never once did he utter that phrase. Okay. And certainly we need to seek godly counsel. And, there may be times that we need to bring in, an outside person to help us consider the situation before we even really get started, to try to understand our own motivations, try to understand our own issues that may be at the heart of this. And we talked a lot about looking into our own eyes, make sure that we're getting the sin out of our own lives before we start trying to work on someone else. The second step is to affirm relationships. And this is, I think, especially hard sometimes in the midst of conflict when we're upset with someone, when our emotions are running hot. To understand that our purpose in reconciliation is what? What are we reconciling? We're trying to reconcile our relationship, right? God sent Jesus to reconcile us to him. He wanted to have a relationship with us, but sin had made that impossible. And so when conflict makes our relationships with one another difficult, our attitude needs to be not revenge, not, getting back what's been lost physically or materially, but restoring our relationship to one another. And so we need to affirm our relationship. We need to demonstrate a genuine concern and care for that other person. And then thirdly, we need to understand interests, and that's identifying the other's concerns, their desires, their needs, limitations, or even their fears. And again, that is not something, it's not information that people always just volunteer readily. And it's especially not information that they're going to volunteer if we haven't done this part. If they feel like our relationship is broken, if they feel like our relationship is not what's important in this situation, then why are they going to be vulnerable to tell us what they're afraid of, what they're struggling with? It becomes much easier to fall back to their position and what they want, to say, it's not my fault, it's not my responsibility, and to behave like crawfish do. And then the fourth thing is to search for creative solutions. And that's what we're going to finish up with here, is we're going to look at a creative solution here in just a moment to a problem. But oftentimes we're going to have to really think about, how can we get around this? How can we get through this problem? And we certainly need to pray God's wisdom on the situation and ask for his help. And then lastly, we need to evaluate the options objectively and reasonably. That's evaluate, not argue about them. And again, that's an area where oftentimes, a third party may need to get involved. We may need to ask for some help, especially with that objectivity, because it's very difficult for us, especially in the heat of the moment, to behave objectively and reasonably. When we're upset, we've been wronged, and our emotions are running the show instead of our intellect. Any thoughts or questions about any of that?
I think prepared that seeking counsel can help us get the facts, because we all perceive things according to our own background and our own perspective. And I may see a situation and think that I have facts, but really my background or my perspective is coming into play. And so seeking counsel is say, do you think I'm seeing this correctly? Do you think I have my facts straight? And sometimes that alone can, solve it, or at least give us a little perspective for the other four steps, a little objectivity, and a third party that is objective, not like emotionally involved, is good for that.
Absolutely. And, because if you bring somebody that's completely neutral and outside, they're going to have to ask a lot of questions because they don't know what's going on. They don't know what's happened. And oftentimes, we don't really know everything that's happened, but we think we do. And so we assume knowledge that we don't have, and then that other person comes in and asks a lot of questions, and then we start hearing things that, I did not know that. I did not realize that. I didn't remember that. And it starts changing our perspective and helping us to understand the issue.
It can help us to, a lot of times conflict, there's anger, and that anger, we do this exercise called the anger iceberg. The anger is what we see, like the iceberg, but usually there's all these other feelings or background things that are making us angry. And so that third party can also help us see, you seem angry, but is it because you're hurt, or is it because of you're embarrassed, or, and then that can help us with deeper empathy by realizing what's underlying what are our positions and our interests.
Matthew chapter 10, verse 16. Behold, I am sending you out as sheep in the midst of wolves, so be as wise as serpents and innocent as doves. That combination of wisdom and innocence, of being, humble servants of God, but also using wisdom and discernment is really important in trying to work out these kinds of problems. So with our last 5 minutes here, I want us to turn over to the book of Daniel. And I had not really considered this as a conflict resolution example before, but it's actually a really good one. And so I kind of wish we had more time to talk about it. But Daniel chapter 1, verses 8 through 16. If somebody would read that quickly for us.
Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food and with wine and drink, and therefore he asked the chief of the eunuchs to allow him not to defile himself. God gave Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the chief of the eunuchs, and the chief of the eunuchs said to Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who has signed your food and your drink, for why should he see you are in worse condition than you who are of your own age? You would endanger my head with the king. And Daniel said to the steward of the chief of the eunuchs who was signed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, test your servants for 10 days. Let us be given vegetables to eat and water to drink, and let our appearance and the appearance of you who eat king's food be observed by you, and deal with your servants according to what you see. So he listened to them in this matter, and tested them for 10 days. At the end of 10 days, it was seen that they were better in appearance and fatter in flesh than all youths who ate king's food. And the steward took away their food and wine, and they were to drink, and gave them vegetables.
Okay. So we have here a conflict, right? We have a conflict between Daniel and, we could extend it. We could say the conflict is between Daniel and the king, but we have the king's steward here as his proxy, we'll say. And so the conflict is, what are these guys going to eat, right? And Daniel has a position of, I do not want to defile myself with these things that are unlawful or unclean for me to eat. And the king's steward says, king says you got to eat it, right? What are those? Those are their positions. Now, Daniel is fortunate here in that the king's steward is kind of loose-lipped a little bit, and he reveals, maybe because of the relationship that he had with Daniel and kind of the humility that he saw in him, and the way that he behaved, is Daniel trying to turn this into some kind of freedom march kind of thing? Is he making a big spectacle and scene out of this conflict? No, he comes to him and says, look, this is not something that I can do according to my faith. And so the steward here tells Daniel what? What did he reveal to him? He reveals his interests, right? His interests are to keep his head attached to his neck. And he fears that if, he brings Daniel and these young men before the king and their appearance is not what it ought to be, that they appear that they've not been fed, that they've not been taken care of the way that the king demanded, that's going to be his responsibility, right? And so he's revealed to Daniel his interest. And his interest is not to just make them do what the king says to do because he said to do it. His interest, his real motivation is his own life. And maintaining his position and his good graces with the king. And so this reveals that their interests are not necessarily as in conflict as we first thought. And so Daniel uses some wisdom and uses, no doubt, some help from the Lord and uses his faith, mind you, because I don't know that Daniel had a degree in nutrition science and knew how this was going to turn out. But what did he have? He had wisdom and he had faith. He had faith that God would make sure that they were presented before the king tip top, right? And that if he did not defile himself, that he wouldn't have any problems. And so he proposed a solution to the steward and said, well, let's just try this. Give us 10 days and see what happens. See what happens when we do not defile ourselves with this food. Give us vegetables to eat and water to drink and see how it turns out. And so he agreed to that. He had enough trust in Daniel to do that, and Daniel had faith in the Lord. And so it worked out. And God made sure that they were presented before the king in such a way. Thank you, guys. We've got one more class left, and we're going to kind of review some things and finish up. I appreciate very much your comments and participation.